Welcome to the week 8 of the course Introduction to Complex Biological Systems. So, in this week, I will discuss about a very important concept in biology called evolution. So, you can imagine that or you can consider evolution as the history of life. So, today I am going to give a basic introduction about this history of life, and then in the next few weeks I will take up more specific topics. So, here is a timeline of our evolution. Okay. So, the y-axis gives you millions of years, right. So, that is the timeline in millions of years. The top part which says 0, that is today, that is present day, right. So, 4.5 billion years ago, so 4,500 million means 4.5 billion years ago, formation of earth took place, right. 4,000 years ago, formation of oceans and continents happened. 3,500 years ago was the appearance of first photosynthetic bacteria, right. So, these were sulfur bacteria and also methanogens. So, these were bacteria which can trap solar energy and convert that into chemical energy, right. So, that was the appearance of life that we understand. And then there was appearance of photosynthetic oxygen producing cyanobacteria. So, we will see into these bacteria in more details in the coming slides. 2,500 years ago was the appearance of aerobic bacteria, right. Now, these were anaerobic bacteria. So, you can imagine that maybe something similar to glycolysis would happen, where these high energy molecules will be converted only up to a certain point, right. So, the energy efficiency was not that great, but once this cyanobacteria appeared, they were able to use water as the electron source, and one of the byproducts was this oxygen. So, we will see that over a period of time, the atmospheric oxygen increased. So, the earth changed a lot in this region, and I will discuss that in great details. So, the oxygen increased because of these bacteria which would produce oxygen as a side reaction, right. And that led to something very interesting called the great oxidation event. So, the level of oxygen which was much less than 1% in the atmosphere went up to the current levels, which is around 20%, right, 20-21%. And that led to certain catastrophic events where almost all life forms became extinct, right. And then slowly again this life came back, right. So, I will talk about that in more details in the coming slides. And then around 1.5 billion years ago is the appearance of first protists and first eukaryotes. So, now more complex organisms are appearing, but still these are single cellular organism. Okay. This is something that I have discussed in the previous week, and I will discuss this again, where appearance of these endosymbionts, right. So, these eukaryotes will engulf some of the bacterial some of the primitive bacteria, resulting in the formation of organelles like mitochondria and plastids, right. And then that further helped in their metabolism and production of energy. So, then there was appearance of red and green algae, and then almost 500 million years ago something interesting happened, which is called the Cambrian explosion. Okay. So, in this phase it seems like the organisms there suddenly there was a huge explosion of the different species that evolved, and before that something interesting happened, which is the multicellularity of eukaryotes. So, up to this point we had single cellular organisms. So, here multicellular organisms appeared, and then they diversified very rapidly. So, in a few million years we had all these different species, right, and now we are here present day. So, let us look at these events in more details. Okay. So, this is the level of oxygen. So, you can see that oxygen concentration in our atmosphere, which is plotted on this side, and this is iron deposition height. The x-axis plots the timeline. So, this is present day, and as we go towards the left, it is in the past. So, one is GYA. So, GYA is giga years ago. So, that is 1 billion years ago. So, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, right. So, earth formed somewhere here 4.5 billion years ago. And you can see that the level of oxygen was very low. And then over time, there was this buildup of oxygen, and now it has reached this 20-21% of oxygen concentration. And here you see the appearance of all these different organisms. So, cyanobacteria, purple bacteria, green sulfur bacteria, they evolved or they appeared at all these different time points. And then finally, the multicellular organisms appeared here. So, one of the most interesting things that happened is the evolution of photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is directly related to all the living organisms. As we saw in the previous lectures that sunlight is the major source of energy, right? And photosynthesis is the process that traps that energy. So, as over time photosynthesis became more and more efficient, we saw emergence of more and more complex organisms, organisms which can harness this energy in a better way, right? So, photosynthesis arose early in Earth's history, and the earliest form of photosynthetic life were almost certainly anoxygenic. Anoxygenic means that they did not evolve oxygen, and that is evident from here that all these organisms, they were not producing oxygen, hence the atmospheric oxygen was quite low. Photosynthetic sulfur bacteria such as purple sulfur bacteria and green sulfur bacteria belong to the two major groups of these anoxygenic phototrophs. Okay. The green sulfur bacteria and purple sulfur bacteria evolved independently, but both used bacteriochlorophylls and hydrogen sulfide as the electron donor. So, they were not using water, which is H2O, as the electron donor, they were using H2S as the electron donor. Now, these two bacteria, they are postulated to have evolved independently, and this is something that we will see again and again in evolution, that so this is called convergent evolution. So, the same solution is arrived from different sources. So, we will see that in case of organisms, we will see that in case of proteins also. These bacteria thrived in anaerobic sulfur-rich environments such as deep sea hydrothermal vents and shallow and sulfur-rich lakes. Green sulfur bacteria rely on type 1 photosystems, while purple sulfur bacteria use type 2 photosystems. So, these are shown here. So, this is your green sulfur bacteria which uses this type 1 photosystem, and the purple bacteria uses type 2 photosystem, right. So, these are the reaction centers, they trap energy, the reaction center, its energy goes up, and then there is charge separation. So, the electron is ultimately deposited, and then that creates proton gradient across the plasma membrane, and then that proton gradient is used to synthesize ATP, right. Now, these two bacteria had these two different photosystems or the reaction centers, and in the current organisms, so in current eukaryotes, we have seen this already, that both these photosystems are incorporated, right. So, light is absorbed twice, and the electron which goes up in energy, it loses. So, there is proton pump done here, and then again it is raised by absorption of another photon in photosystem 1, and then again it comes back and more proton is pumped. So, either it produces this high energy molecule or it goes back into this cytochrome B6F complex to create this proton gradient. So, over time these two photosystems which evolved separately or independently, they got incorporated together into these higher organisms. The electron source in this anoxygenic photosynthesis, as I mentioned earlier, was not water, right. So, it was not water, hence oxygen was not produced. Instead, hydrogen sulfide or ferrous iron or some other organic molecules were used as electron source. So, the reactions can be written like this: hydrogen sulfide gives up proton, electrons are released, hydrogen sulfide gives up proton, 4 electrons are released and sulfur is formed. Similarly, ferrous gets oxidized to ferric and electrons are released. The ancient atmosphere was composed of methane, carbon dioxide and nitrogen. So, there was not much of oxygen. So, these oxygens that lived then did not rely on the oxygen water cycle, but were linked to other molecules in a strictly anaerobic biochemistry. So, we can imagine that one of the earlier organisms where this photochemical reaction center evolved, it was most probably a single gene. So, one protein, and it produced two copies, so it was a dimer. That single gene was the original photochemical reaction center, and then over time it accumulated mutations, so it got changed into all these different photochemical reaction centers. So, at the beginning both ancestral types were homodimeric. So, you see that these two ancestral types are homodimeric, that is denoted by the same color, both are same color, right. And then they diverged, but they are still homodimeric. Now, at this point maybe some mutation accumulated in this gene, not this gene. So, the gene duplication happened, right. Now, some mutation happened in this gene and it changed this protein. So, even though overall protein remains the same, architecture and everything remains the same, but they become slightly different, right. Same thing happened here, same thing happened here, same thing happened here, right, or maybe this is same. So, same thing happened here. So, like this ancestral protein kept accumulating mutations that resulted in slightly different versions of these proteins, which will perform slightly different functions. And finally, this crown group of cyanobacteria inherited this heterodimeric photosystem 2, which is this, and the heterodimeric photosystem 1, which is this. So, it got both these two photosystems and combined them like we saw in the previous slide. So, now these cyanobacteria, they were producing oxygen, right, and that led to something which is accumulation of oxygen over time, and that is called this great oxidation event. So, a pivotal transformation in Earth's history, so this is almost 2.4 billion years ago, was characterized by a dramatic and permanent increase in atmospheric oxygen levels. So, this was primarily driven by cyanobacteria, which is capable of oxygenic photosynthesis, which means that it released oxygen as a byproduct of splitting water molecules. So, instead of withdrawing electrons from hydrogen sulfide, these bacteria were withdrawing electrons from water, and in that process they were producing oxygen, which means that the atmospheric oxygen levels were slowly going up. Oxygen producing microbial mats thrived in shallow seas, right, and they were using this water source as generously, right. Now, dissolved iron in oceans reacted with this oxygen. So, since they were producing this oxygen, it means that dissolved oxygen in the seas was also increasing, and that was reacting with this dissolved iron and started forming iron oxide, which is this red precipitate, right, rust, and that formed this iron oxide precipitates. So, this process initially delayed atmospheric oxygen buildup, but it created geological evidence of oxygenation. So, if you dig in certain places, what you can see is layers of iron oxide deposition, right, and that gives us geological evidence of this event, that is this great oxidation event. Free oxygen reacted with reduced sulfur also and carbon compounds. So, gradually saturating these things, right. So, these sources of hydrogen sulfide and also methane, they were gradually depleting. Marked transition from a reduced atmosphere to an oxidizing one happened, which enabled aerobic respiration. However, it created a really toxic environment for anaerobic bacteria. So, most of these anaerobic bacteria would actually die because of this great oxidation event. But since aerobic metabolism evolved because of the presence of oxygen, which results in production of more energy, as we have seen in the previous lectures. So, more energy utilization means that more complex functions can be done. So, the stage was set for the evolution of more complex life forms. So, one of the things that happened because of this great oxidation event is rapid cooling of Earth, and that led to something which is called the snowball Earth hypothesis. So, it is imagined that Earth formed a snowball like this, where it was completely covered with ice. So, the great oxidation event, this led to the significant increase in oxygen and altered Earth's chemistry, right. Now, because of this increase in oxygen, methane crisis happened. So, methane would react with this oxygen, increased oxidation led to methane oxidation and reduces this greenhouse effect. So, you lose methane, which had a greenhouse effect, which means that it traps this heat on the Earth's atmosphere. So, now that heat is lost. So, the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere will gradually decrease because of loss of this methane. The reduced greenhouse effect leads to Earth cooling, and this is called this Paleoproterozoic snowball Earth. You can imagine it looked something like that, where ice covered all of the planet, right. Now, feedback loops and ice expansion. So, one thing led to another. Ice sheets expanded, increased Earth's reflectivity. So, if it is white like this, the solar energy that comes in, it will be reflected off, right. So, less amount of heat energy was absorbed by the planet, right. So, that led to further cooling. So, this reduced heat absorption and reinforced the global cooling of the planet. As a result, most organisms died. Okay. So, this is also called this oxygen catastrophe because it is triggered by this oxidation event. So, anaerobic bacteria died due to rise in oxygen levels. Methagens died because methane was also captured due to low methane levels. Cyanobacteria survived in some ice-free refuges. So, most cyanobacteria would die, but there were some pockets where some of these cyanobacteria would survive, right. Then over time, volcanic eruption, buildup of carbon dioxide, right, created a strong greenhouse effect which eventually melted the ice, and this cycle influenced atmospheric evolution and early life development. So, this event sort of made this transition from anaerobic to aerobic respiration for these microorganisms. Okay. So, again this is the summary, and we have reached up to this point, right, that these aerobic bacteria are now thriving after this great oxidation event. So, what was the impact of this great oxidation event on Earth's biosphere? So, large scale extinction of anaerobic life form due to oxygen toxicity, that happened, right. Evolution of aerobic respiration enabled higher energy yields because now you can use oxygen, so you can oxidize your molecules further and you can get greater yield of energy. Foundation of complex eukaryotic life and multicellular organisms. Since we can utilize energy better, more complex life forms evolved. So, this is just a reminder that aerobic pathways produce 32 ATP molecules per glucose, whereas anaerobic respiration produces only 2, right. So, this higher energy production resulted in more complex functions. So, support for energy intensive processes like movement and reproduction, all of these were supported because we can utilize energy better, or organisms can utilize energy better now. Development of mitochondria and eukaryotes via endosymbiosis, that also helped. Another byproduct of this increase in oxygen level was the formation of the ozone layer, which protected life from UV radiation. Then finally, these enhanced ecological niches were created, which resulted in biodiversity in the subsequent eras. So, we can imagine that before this great oxidation event, our planet looked something like this because of sulfur and iron, right, and after the great oxidation event, it looks something like this. Okay. So, this is something that we have already seen. So, by this time eukaryotes have evolved and something interesting happened, which is called this endosymbiosis. So, this is the ancestral eukaryote. So, it has the nucleus, right. Now, this ancestral eukaryote engulfs one of this bacteria. So, this is an aerobic bacteria, right. So, it engulfs this bacteria. Once the bacteria is inside the eukaryote, it finds this very rich environment. So, it also multiplies, it survives and it multiplies there. Now, this bacteria over time transfers some of its genes to the nuclear genome, while it retains some, and this bacteria gets converted to mitochondria. So, this is a modern eukaryote which is non-photosynthetic. Okay. Now, this eukaryote would capture a cyanobacteria, and again some of the genes would get transferred to the nucleus and it would retain some other genes, and then this cyanobacteria would eventually get converted to a chloroplast. So, now this becomes a photosynthetic eukaryote, right, because it can capture light energy and convert it into chemical energy. So, eukaryotes evolved. Now, they have mitochondria, they have chloroplasts, so they can do these reactions much better. Something more interesting happened over time, which is transition of these single cellular organisms to multicellular organisms. So, these organisms were single cellular like this, but over time it was advantageous for these cells to cluster together like this, right. So, that helped in their survival, etc., we will see that, and then they can form a higher level organism where these individual cells do not remain exactly the same, but they change, okay, and now they can become a higher level organism. So, we will see the mechanisms. Transition of single cell to multicellular organisms occurred in multiple lineages. So, it happened in many different ways. That is why we have so many different organisms. So, it represented a major evolutionary innovation allowing increased organism complexity, right. So, we have all these different types of organisms and species. What are the evidences? One of the early evidences are this. So, it is an oldest putative multicellular organism, okay. So, it seems to be evolved 2.1 billion years ago. Red algae fossils, they are also found, and they are known to be 1.2 billion years ago that displayed cell differentiation, which means that in the same cluster you will find different types of cells. So, what are the mechanisms? Evolutionary pressures such as predation. So, if they are alone, they can be engulfed by other organisms, but if they form a cluster or a colony like this, then the chance of survival increases. So, you will have, so any mutation that favors this will survive, right. So, this led to aggregation of single celled organisms, cooperation among cells for improved survival and efficiency. So, once they grouped like this, they can exchange materials, they can exchange genetic materials, they can exchange other organic materials, and that also helped in better survival of these organisms. So, eventually any processes, any mutations that would help that will give an advantage, survival advantage to those organisms, right. So, there are several theories of multicellularity. I will discuss the three major ones. The first one is this colonial theory. So, unicellular organisms formed colonies while some cells specialized in different functions. Over time, these colonies developed cell differentiation and led to multicellular organisms. So, you have a cluster of cells. Now, some cells will develop some mutation or gain some mutations so that they will change their characteristics, right, and this will eventually provide them some survival advantage, right. So, this differentiation will ultimately lead to multicellular organisms. So, example is this choanoflagellates. So, they form colonies that resembles multicellular structures. The second mechanism or theory is the symbiotic theory. So, it says that different species of unicellular organisms form symbiotic relationships, right. So, here they are same species, these are different species. Now, they form some symbiotic relationship. So, they can exchange material and they can help each other to survive. These symbiotic partners became interdependent, leading to formation of multicellular organism. The origin of mitochondria and chloroplast, as we have seen, can be considered as an example. Syntactical theory. So, here multinucleated unicellular organism, right. So, you have one cell, but instead of one nucleus, you have multiple nucleus, right. So, this developed inside the cell and then internal membranes will occur that will compartmentalize these nuclei into separate cells. This led to multicellular organisms with specialized cells, right. So, we will see example of this in the next slide. Okay. So, this is the first one, colonial theory. So, what you have is a unicellular flagellated protist. So, it is a single cell, right. So, the ancestors of animals were unicellular flagellate protists like this. These protists began forming colonies where individual cells remain attached after division rather than separating. So, once this divides, instead of separating out, they will form cluster like this, right. So, over time, some cells within the colony specialized for different functions, leading to the division of labor. So, some of these cells, they will gain mutations and they will become specialized cells. So, they will perform certain other functions compared to this. So, this division of labor will eventually help in the survival of this colony of cells. Eventually, these colonies evolved into true multicellular organism with coordinated cellular functions and communication, right. So, now these cells will start to fold, they will have a particular arrangement, and they will also evolve more cells which will have different functions, and finally, they will become an organism, multicellular organism. Okay. So, this is the third one, syntactial theory. So, this is the cell with multiple nuclei. So, multinucleated ciliated protist. Okay. The ancestor of multicellular organisms was a large multinucleated organism similar to modern ciliates, right, or some Plasmodium slime molds. This single-celled organism developed internal membranes to separate individual nuclei. So, now they will start developing internal membranes like this, where each of these nuclei will now get separated, right, eventually forming distinct cells. So, this one will form one cell, this will form another cell, this will form another cell. These separated cells began to specialize, leading to development of different cell types. Okay. So, now if they start becoming different, so you will have different cell types and different functions. So, over time this organism evolved into a true multicellular form with coordinated cellular functions. There are several advantages when organisms transition from unicellular to multicellular. So, first one is increase in size. So, larger organisms were less vulnerable to predation. So, they can protect themselves better. Plus, this allowed access to new ecological niches. Division of labor. Since there are multiple cells of different types, specialized cells can be developed which can use the resources better. Cells, they can help in reproduction, cells that can help in defense. So, this type of division of labor will help in the survival of the organism. Environmental stability. So, multicellular structures resisted environmental fluctuations better than the single-celled organisms. Challenges: coordination. So, developing communication pathways between the cells, which is signaling molecules. So, these things were slow to develop, but these were some of the challenges, right. Resource distribution. So, how do you distribute all the resources between different cell types? So, effective nutrient and oxygen distribution systems have to be evolved. Waste management. So, there are many byproducts that are formed and that have to be excreted out. So, removal of metabolic byproducts required advanced systems. Genetic and cellular mechanisms. So, what were the genetic and cellular mechanisms which help these multicellular organisms to stay multicellular? Okay. So, the first one that is needed obviously is the cell adhesion. So, these cells have to stick together, right. So, for that specialized proteins evolved such as cadherins and integrins which allow these cells to stick together. So, these are like molecular glues. So, that will allow these cells to stick together. Intracellular communication. So, now these cells, they have to communicate with each other via again more specialized type of proteins. So, evolution of gap junctions and signaling molecules evolved for this type of cellular communications. And then once these multicellular organisms evolved into more complex organisms with different body plans, more types of genes evolved such as regulatory genes. So, one such regulatory genes are the Hox genes. So, these are transcription factors which control the body plan development and cell differentiation. So, starting from this single zygote, the cells, once they start dividing, which cell will form the head, which cell will form the torso, which cells will form the limbs, those are decided by these Hox genes. So, this type of specialized proteins or genes evolved that will determine the body plan of an organism. Gene networks. So, these also evolved, and so they enabled tissue specialization, right? Emergence of complex structures. So, we have exactly same number of genes in all the cell types, but different genes are expressed in different cell types, resulting in the formation of different tissues. So, these gene networks evolved over time. Energy demands. Aerobic respiration supported higher energy requirement for this multicellular life. So, multicellular life was supported a lot because of the evolution of aerobic respiration. So, what were these evolutionary milestones? Tissue differentiation. So, now more complex organisms have evolved with different types of tissues. For example, we have all these different tissues, skin cells, liver cells, heart muscle, brain, like that. So, development of specific cell types for functions like digestion, reproduction and protection. This happened. So, protection means immunity. Emergence of symmetry. So, shift from radial to bilateral symmetry allowed streamlined movement and sensory specialization. So, if you see a starfish, that is radial, right? But if you see yourself, we have this bilateral symmetry. So, that shift happened as more and more complex organisms evolved. And then complex body plans evolved. So, development of cavities like coleums for housing organs. Okay. Reproductive innovations, transition from asexual to sexual reproduction. This increased genetic variation, fueling further evolution. So, again this is the summary. We started from here and we have reached somewhere here, and now this interesting event happened, which is diversification of this multicellular eukaryotes, which is Cambrian explosion. So, Cambrian explosion, it was a brief geological period which is estimated to be almost 500 million years back, right. So, during this, most major animal phyla first appeared according to the fossil record, right. So, it also marks this rapid diversification of body plan, ecological roles and feeding strategies. So, all sorts of different behavior and other things evolved in this time period. So, emergence of modern phyla. Organisms with diverse body plans evolved in this very short time period. Okay. Transition from simple to complex organisms. So, single celled and multiple cellular life form evolved into more specialized forms with tissues and organs. Okay. Development of predator-prey relationships, mobility. So, organisms, they started moving around, burrowing behaviors, so digging hole and staying inside those. So, all of these behaviors also evolved in this time period. And then there were organisms with soft and hard shells, right. So, organisms with shells, exoskeletons and other protective structures became very common. Geological context. So, this occurred shortly after the snowball earth glaciation and during the period of rising oxygen level. Now, there are these significant fossil records which highlight this. However, there are several criticisms also. So, this is a summary of evolution of life on earth, right. So, sun ignites, formation of earth, right. So, then we have this Cambrian explosion somewhere here, which is 500 million years ago. Then all these different life forms evolve and we are somewhere here. So, what are the factors that led to this Cambrian explosion? So, again these are mostly speculation and hypothesis, but based on all the geological and fossil records, geological evidences and fossil records. So, first is of course this increase in oxygen level, right. Breakup of supercontinents. So, that also resulted in these isolated habitats that created different types of ecological systems. End of the snowball earth, right. So, that helped in the formation of a stable environment. Genetic innovation. So, Hox genes which created these different body plans, gene duplication that expanded the genetic material, resulting in this evolutionary experimentation, right? So, different mutations, we will talk about all these things in more details in the next 2 lectures. So, that helped in formation of diverse proteins and functions. Ecological drivers, so predator-prey dynamics, this led to evolutionary arms race. So, this resulted in change in behavior, which was also resulted in adaptation of certain mutations that will give them survival benefits, right. So, anything that has a armor, a hard shell will survive better, anything that can move fast, they will survive better. So, all of these functions evolved because of this predator-prey dynamics. Resource partitioning, exploitation of new ecological niches. So, all of these things led to this Cambrian explosion or evolution of all these different species almost 500 years ago. So, there are of course controversies because these are all based on certain fossil records and mostly speculation, right. So, there is a debate whether Cambrian explosion was true rapid event or an artifact of incomplete fossil records. So, corrupted fossil records can lead to wrong conclusions, right. For example, organisms with hard parts or hard shells, their fossils will survive better compared to organisms which have soft body or soft tissues. So, even though such organisms appeared before the Cambrian explosion, their fossils will not be there and hence we will not know about them. Now, there are evidence from this Ediacaran period which suggests a longer timeline for the emergence of complexity, right. So, what we have is a best guess of evolutionary record of life on Earth. So, I have already listed several references in different slides. These are some of the additional references that you can look into. Thank you.